This is the Dallas Morning News.
From the Dallas Morning News, I'm Abby McCloskey, and this is Beyond Talking Points. For nearly 50 years, Gallup has asked Americans their opinion about the biggest challenge facing the country. And for the first time ever, immigration tops the list. Depending on who you talk to or where you get your news, immigration is the reason why American wages are too low. It's a national security threat. It's the reason why you're voting for Trump or the reason why you never would. Congress keeps killing its own comprehensive bipartisan immigration deals. And now we have one presidential candidate who said the border was secure while crossings surged to record highs after COVID, and the other who's based his campaign on mass deportation and at times using racial slurs. To understand what's actually going on with immigration and how it impacts the economy and our security, and how to balance compassion and justice and good old-fashioned common sense when it comes to reform, we have the leading expert in the country on the topic. Madeline Zavodny is an economics professor at the University of North Florida. She's dedicated her life to understanding immigration policy, and she is here with us today. Madeline, thanks so much for being here. And I want to start by chatting with you about how you got involved in immigration policy.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to talk about immigration anytime, any place. I first became interested in immigration when I moved to Texas from the Boston area in 1996.
Madeline, I didn't know you were in Texas.
I did. I only lasted 9 months, honestly, which I'm a little embarrassed to admit. I moved to Atlanta, which is sort of a smaller version of the Dallas area in many ways. I don't know. It is what it is. But I did live in Texas, in an immigrant-intensive area, I think, where everyone seemed to be talking about immigration. And of course, that has only intensified over the last 20 plus 30 years now. My goodness. So my family's lived in the U.S. for 4 generations. I'm, descendant of immigrants, as almost all of us are, but I'm not an immigrant myself. So I often, am asked why I'm interested in immigration. And I think it really is living in Texas just makes you interested in immigration because it's all around you.
And we met briefing a Republican presidential candidate here in Texas a decade ago, which feels like a lifetime in immigration policy. How have views of immigration changed since then, or how has the national conversation, in your opinion, changed since then?
I think Texas in many ways mirrors how the national immigration conversation has changed. When you think back, there are a couple of governors or so in Texas. Texas really had an opinion that immigration was good for business because immigrants are workers and they're consumers and they're just going to help build the economy and build society. And I think that view was common across a lot of the United States a decade or two ago. And things sort of have changed in large part because of changes that we observed in the wake of COVID and this enormous surge at the border, which was very concentrated in Texas. I will say Governor Abbott is, I think, one of the most politically astute, perhaps, at capturing the moment with his busing program. I think that it took an impact that was very concentrated locally of receiving hundreds of thousands or millions of immigrants coming across the border and diffusing that impact across the country, such that areas that otherwise would have gotten maybe a trickle of immigrants coming in at a slow enough pace for them to absorb it under the radar, instead got huge inflows showing up. And it suddenly made what had been a very local issue very national.
And just to get us up to speed a little bit on the spike of border crossings during COVID, what do you attribute that to? And then kind of more broadly in quote unquote normal times, what does the flow over our border and also visa entry exit points, like what does that look like? How many people are we talking about tend to come year after year into America? And are we in a really different place than we used to be? Or is it just more of the same and you bringing up Governor Abbott with more public attention on it, with political attention on it?
We are in a radically different place than we were pre-COVID. So what it all kind of really dates back to, I think, is the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 was really a sea change in who was coming to the United States. Up until the mid-2000s, until about 2006, the U.S. was experiencing large inflows of both legal and unauthorized immigrants. So in a typical year, we were probably getting on net about 500,000 unauthorized immigrants entering and staying in the United States, mostly coming from Mexico, mostly working age, probably predominantly male. Right? And this is in addition to maybe 800,000 or so legal immigrants on net joining the United States. So coming with visas, typically coming permanently. And then the Great Recession hit. But we had the construction collapse, right? Housing bust, and a lot of the jobs that unauthorized immigrants filled disappeared very quickly. So that flow just halted very quickly. And it did resume even as the economy kept growing, as we slowly kind of crawled our way out of the recession. This is one reason why the housing market right now is right, and why we have such a housing shortage. Construction never really recovered. So these jobs never really came back. And unauthorized immigrants didn't come back either. So on net, in a typical year, we were at zero unauthorized immigration. And we coming. We had enough leaving as well. Every year, it added up to about zero on net. And I know, I think realized it.
Yeah. And Madeline, back then, were more people coming unauthorized by overstaying visas, or was it mostly through the southern border? Because I think we often talk about the borders. That's the only place people are coming across.
So I think until the Great Recession, it predominantly was the border. And then coming out of the Great Recession, we had an increase in the number of unauthorized immigrants who were overstaying visas, exactly like you said. And that's a much more diverse group of immigrants because it's often people who flew here from Asia. Maybe they came from Africa, maybe they even came from Europe, as well as coming from down to the southern hemisphere in Central America. So it's all from all around the world. But again, it netted out to about zero in a typical year. And that's something I think, again, people just aren't very aware of it. Okay, then we get to COVID and borders slam shut all across the world. What Customs and Border Protection start doing is that when unauthorized immigrants, if they're apprehended crossing the U.S., they're just immediately sent back across the border to Mexico in most cases.
And also, going along with the timing of COVID, though, we have President Trump in his first term in office. And, as I recall it, the rhetoric around immigration starts changing. We're talking about building a wall. Now, at that point, we're at the tail end of his term talking about the wall, the parent-child separation. How much of that had a dampening effect on immigration?
Sure. So, again, we're always getting unauthorized influx. And what we should really be interested in is probably the net number, not the number coming in, but the number being added when you account for people who are leaving as well. And so I think there was a lot of focus during this period on people coming across the border and the family separation policies, which were, very distressing to see children and families in those situations. Wow. Again, the unauthorized population wasn't growing during that period, and that wasn't new to Trump. It was already occurring for a decade before him.
Okay, that's helpful. But then all of a sudden something changes, and there's a surge at the border. What changed?
Okay, so what changed? So there were these kind of periodic little surges that were occurring, like particularly of unaccompanied minors. In the decade in between the Great Recession and Trump taking office. But again, the net's kind of zero. And a lot of it is the conditions at home were fairly stable in most countries. The U.S. economy, again, had this kind of sluggish recovery. We get to COVID. Borders slammed shut. We're pushing anyone back. And some people are staying in the United States who otherwise might have gone home. But you end up with kind of a pent-up population along the border who otherwise would have been entering, and we've just sent them back without any consequences. So you have kind of a growing population there that's really desperate to enter the United States. At the same time as the U.S. economy starts roaring back very quickly, even during COVID, right? While down on the South, so Mexico and further south, Central and Southern America, South America, economies are not recovering as quickly as the United States. So it's a combination of the magnets getting stronger in the United States, because you think about how many jobs were unfilled as we came out of the COVID recovery, particularly what we would think of as low skill jobs, if you will, in leisure and hospitality, things like that. So there's desperate demand for workers. While at the same time, there aren't jobs where people were coming from. And you have a population massed along the border who have been wanting to come into the United States and are getting sent back if they're apprehended. So this just becomes a recipe to have a strike. And indeed we did. We kept sending people back for a while. Then we finally ended that policy. And we saw these enormous numbers of apprehensions and lots of pressure on the Texas border in particular.
And where are we right now? It's fall, it's presidential election year. Has that settled down? Are we
It
back
has.
to
Okay.
normal?
So then we had another big change. It's always exciting to study immigration because something new is always happening, right? And then the newest thing, which again most people may not be aware of, was what happened in June. But people were really upset about what this surge at the border. People were coming across, and we weren't sending them back in. Was that people have realized if you ask for asylum, then you're going to be typically admitted into the not always, but typically admitted into the United States, basically told to show up for your asylum claim to be adjudicated in court, in immigration court, and that's going to take years because the number of people asking for asylum is just skyrocketing. So we now have millions, literally, of people who have asked for asylum and are waiting for their claim to be adjudicated, and they've been released into the United States after about 6 months after they've filed their application for asylum. They get a work permit so they can work legally in the United States. But people very quickly realize that this was the way to go. That if you are apprehended crossing the border, or if you cross the border, maybe you should even seek out a Border Patrol agent and ask for asylum, because then you start along this process, particularly if you're not from Mexico. If you're from further south, where it's going to be harder to repatriate you back home, and maybe there's a chance you have a legitimate claim for asylum because of political conditions at home and so on.
And what changed in June related to this?
So finally, in June, I think the Biden administration realized people were very upset about this in some parts of the country, and basically made it harder for people to ask for asylum, such that Border Patrol is now going to scrutinize those claims more carefully at first glance and send more people back to Mexico. And in particular, I think the Biden administration started working more with the government of Mexico in order for Mexico's Border Patrol on its southern end to do a tougher job of letting people start coming north. So a lot of international cooperation has increased.
Interesting. And so the Biden administration was slow to act on immigration, but Congress for decades has been coming up with bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform that would deal with asylum, undocumented immigrants, our legal immigration system, which is a mess. We had the Gang of Eight while President Obama was in office. We had multiple attempts, at least two, for reform during the George W. Bush administration. We had a bipartisan deal this winter on immigration. They keep falling apart, and I think there's a question of why are they falling apart? Who doesn't want us to have a more humane, just, common sense system?
I think it's an incredibly complicated problem because there are so many ways to enter the United States, and yet for one of the biggest groups that wants to enter the United States, there isn't a way to do so legally. And therefore, you have people who cross the border illegally or overstay a tourist visa and enter into the unauthorized population. And in some cases now are asking for asylum when they probably don't meet the legal conditions for asylum. We make it very hard for most people to get a visa unless you are very highly skilled. So you're typically a college graduate with a job offer in hand. Then you can get temporary permission in some cases to work in the United States. But we limit the number of those visas that are available. Or if you are the immediate relative of a U.S. citizen. So if you marry a U.S. citizen, then it's going to typically, unless you have been an unauthorized immigrant, be a way for you to become a permanent resident on the pathway to becoming a U.S. citizen. But if you're a person in Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador who wants a better life for yourself and your kids, so you want to come to the United States to work and have your American dream, there isn't really a way for you to do it legally. So we make it hard.
Yeah.
Perhaps rightly so in some cases, because otherwise, how many people would try to come? But the
Right.
fact that it's just such a complicated problem with so many, what feels like on one hand a lot of legal ways to enter, and yet not enough legal ways, makes it a really difficult system to fix because there's not an obvious.
Well, and this is a great lead in to talk about what both campaigns are proposing. And then, of course, want to talk about, as an expert in the policy, what you would want to see done, because it's a really complicated issue. I'm looking at Donald Trump's campaign website, and the first two issues or talking points are, quote, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. And number two, carry out the largest deportation operation in American history. And I'm wondering, what's the rationale behind this? Are these just talking points given the complexity of our border and visa entry exit points? How do you weigh this type of approach?
No one can claim that the borders really heal. But on the other hand, I think there are probably diminishing returns. I sound like an economist there, about further increasing border security. And instead, we probably want to focus on uh, in the interior, and in particular, things that we have done for over a decade. That if you are a convicted criminal, um, then and you're not a U.S. citizen, then we typically deport you after you've served your prison sentence. So we probably want to get rid of bad apples, if you will, first, and we already do that. This and so that's one thing. But this mass deportations idea that we have probably a population of about 11 million unauthorized immigrants living in the United States. Probably at least a million of them have a U.S. citizen child. About a million of them, overlapping there, are married to a U.S. citizen. Others are married to a legal immigrant. The idea that we're going to take people who, on average, have lived in the United States for over a decade and send them home when they have deep community ties in the U.S. is somewhat distressing. And then most of them work, and so their employers are quite dependent on them. And so I thought that we would lose very rapidly about 8 million workers would be absolutely devastating to our economy. This would not create jobs for American workers. It would ultimately cost jobs to American workers.
As an economist, Madeline, I want to spend another minute on this because I think, yes, to me, the idea of mass deportations horrific from a humanitarian and economic perspective. But there are many who might say that, well, it's a good thing that immigration takes away jobs from U.S. workers, and having a self-imposed labor shortage will raise the wages for American citizens, and it might take some shuffling, but in the end, we'll be better off. Kind of, how do you think about that?
There would be a whole lot of shuffling. The economic dislocations would be astonishing. I think inflation's been coming down, but prices have remained high. We would have another bout of inflation and be stuck ultimately with even higher prices if we lost a lot of the workers who pick the crops, make the meals, serve them in restaurants, help take care of children and the elderly. There's so many jobs that unauthorized immigrants fill. And we really don't have an excess supply of American workers who would step in to take those jobs. Wages would have to go way up for those jobs in order to entice people to do them. there literally really aren't enough workers available, and those higher wages and shortages would mean higher prices. And I don't think anybody wants that.
Hmm. And on the other point of, you know, quote unquote, sealing the border, when Trump was in office, they did build miles of a wall. I don't think the whole thing or what they planned to, and yet we had unprecedented surges at the border years after that wall was completed. So, on that point, like, what does it take for a wall to work or seal the border?
So we've been building walls for a long time, and some parts of the border can't be sealed well with the wall, either because there's a river there or because the environmental cost would be very high. But what happens when you start closing off part of the border, either via a physical barrier or just really staffing it up with a lot of Border Patrol agents, is that you just ultimately divert the flow to another area. Now, the flow does slow down and maybe get a little bit smaller, but mainly it just goes to another part of the U.S. Mexico border, which means a more remote part. And so you end up with more deaths happening in the desert, in the mountains, and so on. So there's definitely a humanitarian cost. What we probably need are a lot more high-tech solutions. Drone. I don't know if this is drones or what, but also again working with our partners in origin countries and in transit countries, Mexico and to its south, to slow the flow if we're trying to do that.
And I want to talk about Vice President Harris's approach also. But before leaving Trump, while he was president, he oversaw the separation of parents and kids in the border, like you mentioned, which I found extremely upsetting. I had friends in the administration, and even many of them had a hard time knowing what was actually going on. And some of the rhetoric was that, oh, this is nothing new. It's what we've always done, maybe at a slightly different scale. And to some extent, that argument can be used about, well, we've always kind of built walls, or we've always had deportations of BAGA. This is just more of the same. What are your thoughts on what happened while he was president with parents and kids at the border?
I think that it is pretty upsetting to know that there are several hundred kids who will never be reunited with families who want them. That said, there are legitimate concerns also about people using a child because they think that it gets them favorable treatment when they cross the border. So I think these are very difficult issues. We also don't want to release children from custody too quickly into situations where they're also vulnerable to abuse. I think that it is a situation where there is no easy answer because it's just an upsetting, difficult issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I have 3 young kids, and some of those images of little kids holding on to their parents' legs and being taken away or breastfeeding, that's not, you know, kids can't act that well. That's a real connection that's being broken.
But can I say one more thing about the Trump administration? Okay, so about both of them knows what either of them is really going to do, because you pick a day and what you hear, differs from what you may have heard previously. But I also think it is important to recognize that the Trump administration, has a record of 4 years that we can look back on, which is also restricting legal flights. So of skilled immigrants coming in with visas, of making it harder for U.S. International students who graduate from a U.S. university to stay in the United States or to come to the United States to study. So I think that it's not just unauthorized flows that might go down. It would also be a reduction in legal, highly educated immigrants.
And what would be the implications of that economically or otherwise?
I think that would be particularly bad for our economy because it's such a source of innovation, invention, entrepreneurship. We have a lot of high-tech companies. Our initiative to build more computer chip makers in the United States, whatever's the AI revolution, all of this depends on both U.S. and international minds at the highest caliber. We want those workers.
Thanks for that, Madeline. Let's talk about Vice President Harris. She's vice president, right? Not president, but still we have a record to look at. President Biden didn't visit the border until I believe it was last year in 2023. Harris went on record, on the Sunday shows, saying that the border's secure. This was as it was spiking in all that pent up COVID flow, like you were talking about. So I think it's pretty clear that progressives have underplayed the issue for some time, so much so that Harris is tacking back right in her acceptance speech, saying they'll bring back the bipartisan immigration deal that Trump and Republicans blocked. What do you think Harris's approach to immigration policy is, and what she'd plan to do?
It is very unclear what her approach would be and how it would differ from what the Biden administration has done. In part because of the Biden administration, you had this big sea change again in June about how they were going to treat unauthorized immigration at the border. It's very hard to know what would happen. My guess is, though, that based on things that she has said, that she would strongly support a pathway to legalization for long-term unauthorized immigrants. So a big part of this population of 11 million-ish unauthorized immigrants that we have here that don't have a route to become legal residents and eventually U.S. citizens if that's what they want to do. So I think she would support that, which has been a holdup probably in some of the earlier legislation. Importantly, that bipartisan bill that you'd mentioned that that Trump basically tried to veto and get the Republicans in Congress to not support it successfully in this past winter, it did not have any of these provisions for the current long-term unauthorized population. So the dreamers were kind of left out in the cold. And so I think she would probably support something that would give a route to legal status for these types of groups.
And what is your thought on the dreamers? Because I think there is a case that, well, Democrats have made the problem worse by executive actions that then leave people in this limbo, like the dreamer population, or that the approach to them can change administration to administration. What's your thought on using executive action to address these issues?
I think it's a big problem. Both Republicans and Democrats have become incredibly adept at using executive action to carry out their own wishes, and in part because of failures on the part of Congress to pass anything. So back to your earlier question, why hasn't Congress done anything? Sometimes it's employer lobbies, sometimes it's unions. I have no idea why they haven't been able to do anything. In the face of them not doing anything, we then end up with executive action and then a flip-flopping as administrations change. And you end up with groups like Dreamers just being caught in the middle.
Yeah, it's awful. Speaking of kind of flip-flopping, so a couple years ago, it seemed like, at least listening and to the news, that a significant part of the Democratic Party wanted to defund ICE, and there was talking points on the right of, they wanted to fund the police, they wanted to fund DHS and border security, and this is just kind of a chaotic crime, fentanyl-ridden free for all. What's your view on that? Was that overblown? Is that, in your thought, a real significant part of the Democrat Party? How would you think about that issue?
I think ICE has really scaled back from its peak. What we typically see is more the focus on employers violating the laws of against hiring unauthorized workers during Democratic administrations, and during Republican administrations, maybe more focus on these high-profile workplace raids like happened under Trump. But ICE has been continuously in the ground carrying out these deportations, again, of people who are convicted felons who aren't U.S. citizens after they've served their sentence, or if you are, I'm not a lawyer, I should caveat all of this. If you're booked into jail, your fingerprints are run through the system, if you will, and one system that they're run through now is through the immigration system. And so this puts up a flag to ICE of if your fingerprints are associated with somebody who has an immigration violation. And then ICE can issue what's called a detainer for you to be held. This is very different from something we saw for a little while in some communities, like traffic stops. So it's sort of the equivalent of a workplace raid, but just randomly being out in the community. And I think those are pretty terrifying to the immigrant community and even to U.S. citizens of color who are worried about racial profiling and such. So I think that ICE has scaled back now more to the jailhouse enforcement model that I think most Americans would support. Unfortunately, there are sometimes U.S. citizens who get caught up in it and falsely, flagged in the system. That is very unfortunate. But I think the very kind of scary model that we seem to be headed toward for a while and might be headed toward again under Trump, we probably wouldn't see that under a Harris administration. And I can't imagine that would defund ICE. ICE does important things, right? We need immigration and customs enforcement.
Right. And one more economic issue before we shift to your approach to it. As the Republican Party becomes more isolationist in nature, I think one of the ways that policy leaders and immigration have sought to reduce the flow of people over our southern border, in particular, has been foreign aid and foreign aid to Latin American countries, which, if that persists, seems like it would be squarely in the Democrat camp. Is that a helpful way to address our own domestic immigration challenges?
Foreign aid sounds nice, but honestly, it's not the way that we're going to reduce immigration flows for at least a generation. A lot of the people who are coming to the United States are coming from very impoverished areas. And if you make things better in those areas, it sounds intuitive to think, oh, well, people will stay. Well, actually, maybe you're going to give people more resources and allow more of them to leave. Because when you think about it, if your area is really bad, like if there's a drought, a natural disaster, no jobs, your family's starving, the first thing that you're probably going to do is move within your own country, within your own region. To the United States, it's a long way. It's a very expensive journey, particularly if you have to hire a smuggler. So you have some resources to do that. So foreign aid, paradoxically, in the short run, gives people in impoverished communities more resources that can actually lead to more international migration in the short run. But it is important to, I think, to help the world economy be more prosperous and all of these good things. But I don't think that we should regard foreign aid as a way to reduce international migration.
Yeah. So there's reasons to do it, but not necessarily for the reason of reducing our own immigration situation. Well, let's shift gears as we kind of close up talking about what each of the campaigns is talking about and talk about a different way forward. What's something that drives you crazy about campaign talking points on immigration?
Oh, that immigrants cause crime. This is, yes, there are some immigrants who commit crimes. And again, I ultimately deport those who are convicted. But it is statistically not true in the United States that immigrants are more likely to commit either property or violent crimes than U.S. born people. It's just not true. In fact, statistically, they're less likely to commit property or violent crimes. And immigrant communities typically have lower levels of crime. So that just drives me crazy.
Makes sense. Drives me crazy too. Okay, so if you had a magic wand to change immigration policy, and we talked about this is a lot of different things. It's the legal immigration system. It's what's happening at our border and visa entry exit points. And it's the 11 million people who live here, who have families, most of whom I believe have lived here like a decade or more. It's these three pieces. Kind of what do we do about it?
I think we need to think about how to increase legal pathways. And in particular, I think we want good temporary pathways that can lead to permanent pathways for people who come to the United States and they succeed here, that they have jobs, they create community, all of that, instead of them either becoming unauthorized immigrants when their visa expires, or in the case of lots of Indian immigrants on temporary skilled worker visas, just staying over and over and over and over and over, renewing that visa, but not having a permanent visa available for them, and then their children being caught in limbo. So that's something I haven't talked about yet, which is a group called the Documented Dreamers. And so there's many groups that kind of fall by the wayside as a result of policies. And I think that skilled immigrants are a group that we don't treat terribly well in the United States, particularly their children. And right now, really, again, you can get a temporary visa in some cases if you're really highly skilled. We don't have a lot of temporary visas for less skilled workers. We have them in ag, but in non-ag, we only have 66,000 available of temporary low skilled seasonal worker visas uh, for non-agricultural workers in the average year. 66,000.
But Madeline, let's spend a minute on this because I think it's really important, the economic argument around immigration. I know the one about crime drives you crazy. To me, the economic argument at times drives me crazy because there's a thought of why would we want more unskilled immigrants or even skilled immigrants here? Again, because doesn't it take away from U.S. jobs? Doesn't it decrease our wages? Isn't it a drain? This is something that you and Pierre Ranius at the Dallas Fed have written a lot about. Like, what is the budget impact? Is this a drain of more benefits? Is it actually a net positive? Can you talk to me about a broad brush and then also these different groups, what the economic effects of immigration are in the U.S.?
So there's an enormous economic literature on the labor market impacts of immigration and more broadly, the economic impacts of immigration in the United States. I think a lot of non-economists would be surprised at how kind of cohesive these findings are, but there's a very clear consensus that immigrants have a near zero impact on labor market outcomes, by which we mean earnings, employment, being in the labor force, types of jobs that U.S. natives hold. There's very little effect. So one reason why there's not much effect is because honestly, we get that many immigrants in the United States in terms of the inflow. 15% of our population right now is foreign born. But think about how many people are coming each year. So it's maybe typical year, setting aside the surge, a little less than 1 million or so entering, maybe 1.5 million. Compared to the size of our labor force and our population, that's a very small number. We can easily absorb those immigrants and absorb those workers. And indeed, employers in many areas want those workers. Now, that's it. This is not to say that there aren't negative effects on some groups. And those negative effects, unfortunately, are very concentrated at the very bottom of the U.S. education distribution, because that's where kind of the immigrant inflow for decades was the biggest. When back until, again, the Great Recession in the mid-2000s, when we were getting large inflows of young men coming from Mexico, most of them didn't have much formal education. So they competed with U.S. natives who didn't have high school diplomas for manufacturing, construction, kind of lower, less skilled, if you will, jobs. And that group probably experienced some negative impact. And earlier immigrants who'd come maybe a decade or two before, in particular, really competed with those newly arriving immigrants for jobs. So I think that economic and labor market costs were kind of most concentrated on the group that was already most vulnerable. But for the average American, it's really a zero.
Interesting. And I suppose in the same way that foreign aid can be a good idea, irrespective of what it does with our immigration situation, presumably there are ways that we can better and more directly support lesser skilled, lower wages Americans than clamping down further on immigration. I mean, am I over my skis there, or do you agree?
I think it's a very hard issue because at some age it's hard to go back to school and retrain and get a new job. If you don't want to move because you have your family and your community where you're from, so if the jobs aren't where you are, maybe you don't want to move to where the jobs are. So I think it's a very difficult issue. But an important thing to realize, immigrants are also an easy scapegoat. And yes, at the very kind of bottom of our educational distribution, there probably has been a small negative impact of immigration. But compared to automation and international trade, particularly with China, immigration is a drop in the bucket. That mechanization, the robots basically in factories, the dropping of tariffs and entering of China into the WTO and its huge globalization push have really been what's impacted manufacturing workers in the U.S. I'm not making an argument for tariffs.
Yeah.
I want to make that clear.
But it's helpful to understand what's scapegoat and what's actually fact. Okay, Madeline, you get whatever you want to do on immigration. Do you have a comprehensive deal, or do we, quote unquote, like seal the border first? Is there an order operations problem and then do comprehensive immigration? What do you think we have to do?
We had effectively had a sealed border under all of Obama, and there was a great plan put forward by the gang. Well, maybe not great, but a good plan put forward by the Gang of Eight. Yeah, that was comprehensive. Where comprehensive means it had everything from permanent to temporary to the unauthorized, with a pathway toward legalization for some of these very complicated parts were being addressed under that package, and it failed. So sealing the border's not enough to do it. I don't know what it's going to take. But we do need to do it because, again, we have this long-term unauthorized population here. We have legal immigrant groups on temporary visas and their children who are just languishing in the system. We shouldn't continue on like we have been.
Yeah, at every poll that I've seen, I don't know if it's the same, is that the majority of Americans, including, by the way, the majority of Texans, support kind of akin what was to in the Gang of Eight of better border security, a more skills-based legal immigration system, and then a way to bring the millions of people who are living here peacefully and with families out of the shadows and include them and assimilate them as full members of our society. So I join you in hoping that happens. What do you want to leave voters with as they think about this issue? Because we're going to see a lot of bumper stickers here, talking points here in the next couple months about the border and deportation and blah, all sorts of things. What do you want to kind of whisper in the voters' ears as they hear these things?
Don't believe what you hear. Yeah, which is, and of course, I've been talking for, half an hour at least, and I think you should believe me. But I think you have to take what you hear with a big grain of salt and recognize immigration is just a very complicated issue. And anyone who gives you a simple solution, it's not going to work. Because there are, again, so many interlocking parts. This idea of sealing the border is not, it's not going to really work. And mass deportations would be economic chaos. We need a better plan than that.
Thank you, Madeline. I agree. Thanks so much for talking about this with me.
Thank you for having me.
Listeners, we'll be back next week to sort through the presidential campaign promises and what America really needs. This podcast is running as part of the American Middle series at the Dallas Morning News. Please like us or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Abby McCloskey, and you've been listening to Beyond Talking Points.